Doc Holliday versus the Cheyenne warriors, the duel history almost erased. In the summer of 1876, somewhere between the scorched plains of Kansas and the unforgiving territories of Colorado, a man with a death sentence in his lungs faced 3 Cheyenne warriors on horseback. He had no backup, no cavalry, no escape route, just a pair of nickel-plated revolvers, a reputation that preceded him like a ghost, and the unshakable calm of someone who had already accepted his own ending. What happened next would be whispered in saloons for decades, then buried by historians who preferred cleaner stories. Until now, this is not the tale of Tombstone. This is not about the OK Corral. This is the story of John Henry Holliday before he became legend, when he was just a dying man trying to outrun his own body, and the unlikely confrontation that revealed who he truly was beneath the cards, the coughing, and the cold-eyed stare that made grown men step aside. Most people think they know Doc Holliday, the gambler, the dentist-turned-gunfighter, the man who stood beside Wyatt Earp in the most famous 30 seconds of the Old West. But that version of Doc, the one frozen in sepia photographs and Hollywood mythology, is only the final chapter. Before all of that, before the legend crystallized into fact, there was a different man, younger, angrier, already dying but refusing to go quietly. And in the vast, lawless expanse between civilization and the frontier, that man crossed paths with warriors whose people had been fighting for their survival long before the first wagon wheel carved tracks into their homeland. The Cheyenne did not know his name. They did not care about his reputation. To them, he was just another pale face moving through territory that had been theirs for generations, another intruder in a long line of intruders. What they did not expect was that this particular stranger would not run, would not beg, would not even flinch when 3 riders appeared on the ridge above him, silhouettes against a sky bruised with the colors of late afternoon. What followed was not a massacre. It was not a heroic last stand. It was something far more complex, something that speaks to the nature of courage, the strange mathematics of survival, and the moments when 2 worlds collide in ways that neither can fully understand. This is the duel history almost erased, and it begins with a train ticket, a diagnosis, and a man with nothing left to lose. Chapter 1. The Dying Man's Gamble. John Henry Holliday was 24 years old when a doctor in Dallas looked him in the eyes and told him he had maybe a few months to live. Consumption, they called it then. The disease that hollowed you out from the inside, filled your lungs with fluid, and turned every breath into a negotiation with mortality. In the humid air of Texas, the illness would progress quickly. The doctor recommended a drier climate, Colorado perhaps, Arizona, somewhere the air was thin and clean, where the lungs could fight back a little longer. Most men would have gone home to die surrounded by family. Most men would have made peace with their God and their past. But John Henry Holliday was not most men. He had already lost his mother to the same disease when he was 15. He had watched her waste away, watched the light leave her eyes piece by piece, and he had sworn to himself that he would not go the same way. Not quietly, not in a bed surrounded by weeping relatives. If death was coming for him, he would meet it on his feet, on his own terms, in a place of his own choosing. So he bought a train ticket west and left everything behind. His dental practice, his reputation as a gentleman from a good Georgia family, his chance at a normal life. All of it traded for the slim possibility of a few more years, and the certainty that whatever time he had left would be spent exactly as he chose. The journey west in 1876 was not the romantic adventure that later generations would imagine. The trains were slow, crowded, and suffocating. The stations were little more than wooden platforms surrounded by mud and desperation. And the further west you traveled, the thinner the veneer of civilization became, until you reached places where the only law was the one you could enforce yourself. Doc Holliday adapted quickly. He had always been intelligent, educated, with a sharp mind for mathematics and probability. Those skills translated easily to the card tables that filled every saloon and gambling hall from Kansas City to Denver. Within weeks of arriving in the territories, he had established himself as a professional gambler, a man who could read faces like most people read newspapers, and who played with the cold precision of someone who genuinely did not care whether he lived or died. That lack of fear made him dangerous. Other gamblers, even the cheaters and the con artists, operated within certain boundaries. They wanted to win, but they also wanted to survive. Doc had no such limitations. He would call a bluff that any sensible man would fold. He would bet everything on a hand, that any cautious player would abandon. And when disputes arose, as they inevitably did in frontier gambling halls, he showed a willingness to escalate that left most opponents backing down before things went too far. He was not yet the legendary gunfighter of Tombstone mythology. His reputation was still forming, still crystallizing from the raw material of desperate choices and violent encounters. But already the stories were beginning to spread. The pale, thin man with the southern accent and the persistent cough, the one who smiled when he should have been afraid, the one who seemed to welcome trouble like an old friend. It was in Dodge City that he first heard serious talk of the Cheyenne. The tribes had been pushed and pushed again, their hunting grounds shrinking, their way of life systematically dismantled by treaties that were signed and then broken, by soldiers who burned their villages, by settlers who carved up the land that had sustained their ancestors for centuries. By 1876, tensions had reached a breaking point. The same summer that saw Custer's catastrophic miscalculation at Little Bighorn also saw dozens of smaller confrontations across the plains, encounters that never made the history books but left bodies scattered across the prairie all the same. Doc listened to these stories with the clinical detachment of a man who had already accepted his own mortality. The dangers of the frontier held no special terror for him. If anything, they offered a kind of clarifying focus, a reminder that every day above ground was borrowed time, and that the manner of one's death mattered as much as its timing. He had planned to continue west to Denver, where the air was said to be even drier, where the mountains might buy him another year or two. But plans have a way of changing in the territories. A card game went wrong, a dispute escalated, and suddenly Doc Holliday found himself on horseback, riding hard through the Kansas night, putting distance between himself and a town where his welcome had expired in a flash of gunfire and breaking glass. He had no particular destination in mind, just west, always west, away from the trouble behind him and toward whatever waited ahead. He rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only when his horse began to stagger with exhaustion. By then, he had left the last remnants of civilization far behind. The prairie stretched out in every direction, an ocean of grass under a sky so vast it made a man feel like an insect crawling across an endless tablecloth. He made camp near a small creek, letting his horse drink while he coughed into a handkerchief, already spotted with the rusty stains that had become his constant companions. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple when he saw them. 3 riders on the ridge above him, motionless against the fading light. Cheyenne. He knew it immediately, even from that distance. The way they sat their horses, the silhouettes of their weapons, the absolute stillness that came from a lifetime of hunting and warfare on these plains. They had been watching him, probably for miles, and now they had decided to make their presence known. Doc Holliday did not run. He did not even stand up from where he sat by the creek. He simply looked up at them, measuring the distance, calculating the odds, running through the same cold mathematics that governed his approach to cards and to life. 3 against 1. Open ground. No cover, except the shallow depression of the creek bed. His horse was too tired to outrun them even if he tried. By any rational measure, he was already finished. But rationality had never been Doc Holliday's guiding principle. He had faced death every morning when he woke up coughing. He had made peace with it years ago, and something in that acceptance, that fundamental indifference to his own survival, had given him a strange kind of freedom that other men could not understand. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a placating smile, but the genuine smile of a man who had finally arrived at an interesting moment. Then he reached for his revolvers, set them on the ground beside him in plain view, and waited to see what would happen next. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Because stories like this, the ones that history tried to bury, the ones that reveal who we really are when everything is stripped away, these are the stories that deserve to be told, and you deserve to hear them. Subscribe now, so you never miss another chapter of the past that shaped who we are today. Chapter 2. The Calculus of Survival. The Cheyenne did not charge. That was the first thing Doc noticed. If they had wanted him gone, he would already have arrows in his chest. Instead, they remained on the ridge, watching, evaluating. He recognized the behavior from his years at the card table. They were reading him, trying to understand what kind of man sat alone by a creek in hostile territory, with the calm demeanor of someone waiting for a stagecoach. The leader of the 3 began to descend the slope. His horse picked its way carefully down the hillside, and Doc could see him more clearly now. A young man, perhaps 25, with the hardened features of someone who had seen more than his share of conflict. He wore a mix of traditional clothing and items clearly taken from soldiers or settlers, a practical adaptation to a world where survival meant using whatever tools were available. Doc remained seated. Any sudden movement would be interpreted as a threat, and while he was prepared to fight if necessary, he was also curious. The Cheyenne had a reputation for being fierce warriors, but they were also known as sophisticated strategists, people who did not waste lives or resources on pointless conflicts. If these three had wanted a simple confrontation, they would have attacked from the ridge with the advantage of surprise and elevation. The young warrior stopped his horse about 30 yards away, close enough to speak, far enough to react if things went wrong. The other two remained on the ridge, their presence a silent reminder that any treachery would be answered immediately. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Doc used the silence to study his visitor. The young man carried a rifle across his saddle, a Spencer repeater that had probably belonged to a cavalry soldier before its current owner acquired it. His face bore the marks of sun and wind, and his eyes held the watchful intensity of a predator assessing potential prey. Doc coughed into his handkerchief, the sound breaking the silence like a stone dropped into still water. The warrior's eyes flickered to the cloth, noted the stains, and returned to Doc's face with what might have been recognition. Consumption was not unknown among the tribes. The disease had swept through native communities with devastating effect, another weapon in the long catalogue of plagues that European contact had brought to the continent. When the warrior finally spoke, it was in halting English, learned from traders or missionaries or the complicated exchanges that defined life on the frontier. "You are sick." It was not a question. Doc inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the obvious. "I am dying," he replied. Slowly, but yes. The warrior considered this information. In his world, a dying man might be shown mercy or might be considered easy prey depending on the circumstances. But a dying man who sat calmly in hostile territory, who made no attempt to flee or fight, who placed his weapons on the ground and waited with apparent indifference for whatever came next, such a man was an anomaly, and anomalies required careful study. "Why do you not run?" Doc smiled his thin, humorless smile. "Where would I go? My horse is tired. My horse is... The nearest town is 2 days behind me, and I have found that running from trouble tends to mean meeting it again later, usually when you are even less prepared." The logic seemed to resonate. The warrior glanced back at his companions on the ridge, exchanged some signal that Doc could not interpret, and then returned his attention to the strange pale man by the creek. "You have come from the east, from the towns of the whites." "I have come from everywhere and nowhere," Doc said. "I am a man without a home, without a tribe, without a future. I am simply passing through on my way to somewhere else. This land is not yours to pass through. I am aware of that." Doc coughed again, longer this time, the spasm racking his thin frame. When he recovered, he continued, "But I mean no harm to you or your people. I have no interest in your land, your hunting grounds, or your way of life. I am simply a dying man looking for a place to do it." The warrior was silent for a long moment. Then he dismounted, a gesture that surprised Doc. On horseback, the Cheyenne had every advantage. On the ground, the equation became more complex. It was either a sign of trust or a test to see how Doc would respond. Doc did not move. His revolvers remained on the ground beside him, within reach but untouched. The warrior walked closer, stopping about 10 feet away. Up close, Doc could see the intelligence in his eyes, the calculating mind behind the warrior's facade. This was not a man driven by blind hatred or simple aggression. This was a strategist, someone who weighed options and considered consequences. "I am called Running Wolf," the warrior said. "My father was a chief of our people. He was taken from us by the sickness that lives in your chest." Doc absorbed this information. The consumption that was ending his life had also claimed this man's father, creating an unexpected connection between two people who should have been enemies. "I am sorry for your loss," Doc said, and meant it. Whatever else he was, whatever violence and deception defined his life, he understood grief. He had watched his own mother die of the same disease, had carried that loss with him across years and miles. Running Wolf studied him with renewed interest. "You speak truth, I can see it. I have no reason to lie. What good would it do me? Most white men lie without reason. It is their nature." Doc could not argue with that assessment. His own career had been built on deception, on reading opponents and manipulating their expectations. But something about this moment, the strange intimacy of two men from different worlds meeting in the vastness of the prairie, called for a different approach. "I am not most white men," he said simply. Running Wolf nodded slowly. "No, I can see that also." He looked back at the ridge, where his companions waited with growing impatience. "My brothers want to take your horse and your weapons. They say you are weak, that you will die soon anyway, and that your possessions should serve the living." "They are probably right," Doc agreed. "About my dying, at least. But I would prefer to keep my horse and my weapons until I do." "And if we take them anyway?" Doc met the warrior's eyes with perfect calm. "Then some of you will die with me. Perhaps all of you. I am very good with those revolvers, and I have nothing to lose. You, on the other hand, have families, futures, reasons to see tomorrow. The mathematics are not in your favor." It was not a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same tone Doc might use to explain the odds of drawing to an inside straight. Running Wolf recognized it for what it was, an honest assessment of the situation, and his respect for this strange, dying white man grew. "You speak like a warrior. I speak like a man who has made peace with death. It gives me clarity." Running Wolf considered this. In his culture, the willingness to die was considered a sacred quality, something that separated true warriors from ordinary men. A person who had released their attachment to life was free in ways that others could never understand. Such a person was dangerous, yes, but also worthy of respect. "There is a camp," Running Wolf said finally. "Half a day's ride to the north. My people are there. We are moving west, away from the soldiers who burn our villages and scatter our herds. We seek the mountains, where we can live as our ancestors lived." Doc waited, unsure where this was going. "You may come with us, for now, until you are strong enough to continue your journey." The offer surprised Doc. He had expected confrontation, negotiation at best. Instead, he was being invited into the heart of a Cheyenne camp, treated as something other than an enemy. "Why?" he asked. Running Wolf smiled for the first time, a genuine expression that transformed his stern features. "Because you are interesting. Because you speak truth when lies would serve you better. And because my father would have wanted to meet a man like you, a warrior who carries death in his chest but refuses to let it make him afraid." Doc looked at his horse, exhausted by the creek. He looked at the vast prairie stretching in every direction, at the sun now touching the horizon, at the three Cheyenne warriors who had somehow transformed from enemies to hosts in the space of a single conversation. "I would be honored," he said. And with those words, John Henry Holliday took the first step into an experience that would change him in ways he could not yet imagine. Chapter 3. Among the People. The Cheyenne camp was not what Doc had expected. He had imagined something primitive, a collection of temporary shelters barely adequate for survival. What he found instead was a carefully organized community, a mobile village designed with the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. The lodges were arranged in a pattern that maximized protection from wind while allowing clear sightlines in all directions. The placement of fire pits, the storage of supplies, the positioning of horses, everything reflected a sophisticated understanding of both the natural environment and the constant threats that surrounded them. This was not survival by accident. This was engineering perfected over centuries. Doc was given a place at the edge of the camp, close enough to be under observation, but far enough from the central areas to avoid causing concern. The people watched him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, the same expression he might have seen in a Dodge City saloon when a stranger walked through the doors. Universal human skepticism, dressed in different clothes. Running Wolf proved to be an excellent guide to this unfamiliar world. He explained the social structure of the camp, the roles of different members, the protocols for behavior that Doc would need to understand if he hoped to avoid giving offense. The Cheyenne valued generosity, courage, and truthfulness. They despised cowardice, selfishness, and deception. In many ways, their moral code was simpler and more consistent than the complex hypocrisies of the civilized world Doc had left behind. The days fell into a rhythm. Doc would wake with the sun, his coughing spells somewhat eased by the dry air of the high plains. He would eat with the families who had cautiously accepted his presence, learning to appreciate foods that were strange to his palate, but clearly nutritious and sustaining. He would spend the afternoons watching the camp's activities, observing the endless work that kept the community functioning. The women did most of the practical labor, but Doc quickly learned that this was not the servile existence that white society might imagine. The women of the Cheyenne held real power within their families and their community. They owned the lodges, made decisions about moving camp, and exercised authority that their counterparts in civilized society could only dream of. It was a different kind of equality, one that Doc found unexpectedly admirable. The men, meanwhile, focused on hunting, scouting, and the constant vigilance that survival required. Small parties would leave camp each morning, returning with game or with news of troop movements, settler caravans or other Cheyenne bands moving through the territory. The information network was impressive, a web of communication that spanned hundreds of miles and kept the community informed of threats and opportunities alike. Doc found himself drawn into conversations with the older men of the camp, the ones who remembered life before the treaties and the broken promises, before the relentless westward push had begun to squeeze their world into ever smaller spaces. Their stories painted a picture of a civilization that had been systematically dismantled, not through fair competition but through betrayal, disease, and the kind of casual cruelty that came from viewing other human beings as obstacles rather than people. For the first time in his life, Doc began to question assumptions he had never even recognized as assumptions. The superiority of white civilization seemed less obvious when you saw what that civilization had done to people who had been living successfully on this land for thousands of years. The march of progress looked different when you realized it was marching over the bodies of those who had gotten in its way. He did not become a convert or an advocate. That was not his nature. But he gained perspective, a broader view of the world that would inform his understanding for whatever time he had left. It was during his second week in the camp that the challenge came. One of the young warriors, a man called Stone Bear, had been watching Doc with barely concealed hostility since his arrival. Stone Bear had lost his brother in a skirmish with cavalry troops the previous spring, and his hatred for white men was deep and personal. The fact that Doc sat peacefully among the people, eating their food and accepting their hospitality, was an offense that Stone Bear could no longer tolerate. The challenge came during the evening meal, delivered in rapid Cheyenne, that Doc could not understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. Stone Bear stood before him, speaking with obvious contempt, gesturing toward the open ground beyond the fire circle. The message was clear: prove yourself or leave. Running Wolf moved to intervene, but Doc held up a hand. What does he want? He challenges you to fight, to prove that you are not a coward hiding behind my protection. Doc rose slowly, his thin frame unfolding with the deliberate grace of a man conserving limited energy. He looked at Stone Bear, at the anger burning in the young man's eyes, and recognized something familiar. This was grief, transformed into rage, the need to strike back at something, anything that represented the forces that had taken someone beloved. Tell him I accept. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Running Wolf looked concerned but nodded and relayed the message. Stone Bear's expression shifted from contempt to something more complex. Surprise mixed with grudging acknowledgement. The rules were explained. No weapons. The fight would continue until one man could no longer stand or chose to yield. Serious injury was not the goal, but it was not forbidden either. This was a test of worth, not a performance. Doc removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms that were thin but corded with lean muscle. His life had not been soft. The consumption was eating him from the inside. But his body had been shaped by years of physical work before the disease took hold. And he had maintained what strength he could through sheer stubbornness. Stone Bear was younger, stronger, and in peak physical condition. By any objective measure, the outcome was predetermined. Doc should have been destroyed within seconds. But fights are not won by strength alone. They are won by will, by intelligence, and by the willingness to absorb punishment that would break lesser men. Doc Holliday had all three in abundance. The fight lasted far longer than anyone expected. Stone Bear was faster and more powerful, landing blows that would have felled most opponents, but Doc refused to fall. He weathered each impact with a grunt of pain, stayed on his feet through sheer determination, and waited for his opportunities. When they came, he exploited them with the precision of a man who had spent years reading opponents across card tables. He could not match Stone Bear's strength, but he could anticipate his movements, could see the patterns in his attacks, could position himself to minimize damage and maximize the effectiveness of his own limited strikes. It was not pretty. It was not heroic in any conventional sense. It was simply endurance, the stubborn refusal to quit that had defined Doc's approach to his own mortality. In the end, both men were exhausted, bleeding, barely able to stand. The fight did not end with a dramatic knockout or a clear victory. It ended when Stone Bear, breathing heavily, looked at the pale, coughing man who still refused to yield and slowly nodded. Respect, hard-earned and genuine. The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and appreciative murmurs. Doc had not won the fight in any traditional sense, but he had proven something more important. He had shown that his courage was not an act, that his willingness to face death was not mere words. He had demonstrated the quality that the Cheyenne valued above all others, the heart of a true warrior. If you are feeling the weight of this moment, if something in this story is resonating with truths you carry in your own heart, pause right now and leave a comment saying, "True courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it decide your path." Let the world know that you understand what real strength looks like. Chapter 4. The Gathering Storm. The peace of the camp could not last. Doc had known that from the beginning. The world beyond the ridgelines was closing in, and no amount of careful movement or strategic planning could hold it back forever. The first warning came from scouts returning from the south. Cavalry, a full company moving through the territory with the methodical precision that meant they were not just passing through, they were hunting. Someone had reported the Cheyenne camp, and the soldiers were coming to deal with it. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Doc had seen panic before, in mining towns when fire broke out, in gambling halls when gunfights began. This was different. There was no panic here, only the efficient execution of plans that had been rehearsed countless times. Lodges were struck with incredible speed. Supplies were loaded onto travois. The elderly and the children were moved first, guided by older warriors who knew the escape routes that would take them to safety. Doc found Running Wolf in the midst of it all, coordinating the defense that would buy time for the others to escape. "You should go with the families," Running Wolf said. "You are not one of us. The soldiers will not harm you." Doc considered the offer for exactly half a second before dismissing it. "I am here," he said simply. "I will stay." Running Wolf studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the truth beneath. Whatever he found there satisfied him. "Can you ride?" "Well enough." "Can you shoot from horseback?" "I have done so before." Running Wolf nodded. "Running. Then you ride with us. We will delay the soldiers while our people reach the mountains. It will be dangerous." Doc smiled his thin, humorless smile. "I am already dying. What is one more danger?" The plan was simple but elegant. The warriors would split into small groups, each taking a different direction, each leaving tracks that would suggest the entire camp had gone that way. The soldiers would be forced to divide their forces or follow just one trail, either option reducing the threat to the main body of refugees. Doc was assigned to Running Wolf's group, along with Stonebear and two other warriors whose names he never learned. They would take the most obvious trail, the one that led directly away from the soldiers' approach, drawing pursuit while the others scattered. They rode hard through the afternoon, pausing occasionally to leave clear signs of their passage. Doc's horsemanship was adequate but not exceptional, and he found himself struggling to keep pace with warriors who had been riding since childhood. But he stayed in the saddle, stayed with the group, refused to be the weak link that endangered the others. As the sun began to set, they reached a narrow canyon that would force any pursuers to approach single file. This was where they would make their stand, not to win but to delay, to buy the hours that would allow the families to disappear into the vastness of the mountains. The position was good. High ground on both sides, limited approaches, excellent cover. 5 men against however many soldiers were following their trail. The mathematics were not favorable, but Doc had long ago stopped letting mathematics dictate his choices. They waited as darkness fell. The soldiers would not attack at night. The terrain was too unfamiliar, the risk of ambush too high. But they would be there at dawn, and the real test would begin. Doc found himself sitting beside Running Wolf as the stars emerged above them, pinpricks of light in a sky so vast it made their concerns seem impossibly small. "Why did you really invite me to your camp?" Doc asked. Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment. "My father, before he died, spoke of a vision. He said that one day a spirit would come to our people, a spirit that carried death within itself, but had learned to make death an ally rather than an enemy. He said this spirit would teach us something important about facing the end of our world." Doc laughed, a dry sound that turned into a coughing fit. When he recovered, he shook his head. "I am no spirit. I am just a man who is dying faster than most. Perhaps, but you have done what my father described. You carry death with you every moment, and yet you do not let it rule you. You face each day without fear, without desperation. That is something my people need to learn. Our way of life is ending. The whites will not stop until they have taken everything. We cannot defeat them, but perhaps we can learn to face our end with the same dignity that you face yours." Doc had no response to that. He sat in silence, staring at the stars, contemplating the strange path that had brought him from a Georgia plantation to a Cheyenne war party on the high plains. When dawn came, so did the soldiers. There were more of them than expected. Not a single company, but elements of 2, perhaps 60 men approaching the canyon mouth with the caution of experienced Indian fighters. They knew this terrain was dangerous. They knew an ambush was likely, but they came anyway because their orders demanded it, because the logic of conquest allowed no alternative. The first shots were fired by Stone Bear, his rifle cracking the morning silence with lethal precision. A soldier fell from his saddle, and the others scattered for cover. The battle had begun. What followed was not the glorious cavalry charge of dime novels and romantic fiction. It was a grinding, brutal exchange of fire, measured in careful shots and patient movement rather than heroic gestures. The warriors knew they could not win a direct confrontation. Their goal was delay, and delay they achieved. Doc found himself in his element in a strange way. His revolvers were not ideal for the distances involved, but as the soldiers tried to work their way into the canyon, the ranges shortened, and his precision became valuable. He fired carefully, conserving ammunition, making each shot count. The consumption that racked his body seemed to fade into the background, overwhelmed by the adrenaline and focus of combat. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The soldiers probed and retreated, suffering casualties they had not expected from such a small defending force. Frustration built among the attackers, and with it mistakes. A lieutenant, impatient with the delay, led a charge that carried him too far forward, too fast. Doc saw him coming, adjusted his aim, and fired. The lieutenant tumbled from his horse, and the charge collapsed into confusion, but the victory was temporary. One of the warriors fell, then another. The defenders were down to 3, their ammunition running low, their position becoming untenable. Running Wolf made the decision. We have given them enough time. The families are safe. Now we ride. They mounted their horses and fled deeper into the canyon, following routes that the soldiers could not navigate at speed. The pursuit continued for miles, through terrain that grew increasingly difficult, until finally the soldiers pulled back, unwilling to risk their horses in territory they did not know. Doc, Running Wolf, and Stone Bear emerged from the mountains as the sun was setting, their horses exhausted, their bodies battered but alive. Behind them the soldiers were regrouping, counting their losses, reconsidering the cost of continued pursuit. It was not a victory. The Cheyenne had not defeated the cavalry or driven them from the territory, but they had survived, had bought time for their families, had demonstrated that they would not be destroyed without cost. In the calculus of their diminishing world, that was as much as anyone could hope for. Chapter 5. The Parting of Ways. The reunion with the main body of the Cheyenne took place in a high mountain valley, a sanctuary that the soldiers would not find and could not reach, even if they did. The families had arrived safely. The children were playing in the grass, and the elders were giving thanks for their deliverance. Doc stood apart from the celebration, coughing into his handkerchief, watching these people embrace a temporary safety that they all knew could not last. He had been with them for nearly a month, had fought beside them, had earned their respect in ways that still surprised him, but he was not one of them, and he never could be. Running Wolf found him as the sun was setting, turning the mountain peaks gold and purple against the darkening sky. "You could stay," he offered. "You have proven yourself. The people would accept you." Doc shook his head. "My path lies elsewhere. I do not know where yet, but I know it is not here. You have your war to fight, your people to protect. I have my own demons to face, in my own way. The sickness in your chest has not improved. No, it will not improve. The only question is how much longer I can delay the inevitable." Doc paused, looking out at the valley. "But I have learned something from your people, something I did not expect." "What is that?" "I have learned that how you face the end matters as much as the end itself. Your people know this. They face the destruction of their entire world with a dignity and courage that puts my own struggles to shame. If I can take even a fraction of that with me, my time here has been worthwhile." Running Wolf nodded slowly. My father would have been pleased to hear those words. He believed that wisdom could be shared between peoples, even peoples who are destined to be enemies. "We are not enemies," Doc said quietly. "We never were. We are simply 2 men facing different battles, with more in common than either of us expected." The parting came the next morning. Doc's horse had been fed and rested. His saddlebags held supplies that the Cheyenne could barely spare, but had offered anyway. Stone Bear, the man who had challenged him to combat, came forward and clasped his arm in the warrior's grip, a gesture of respect that needed no translation. Running Wolf walked beside him as he rode to the edge of the valley. "Where will you go?" "West," Doc said. "Always west. There is a town in Colorado I have heard about, Leadville. They say the silver mines attract all kinds of people, including the kind who have money and poor judgment at card tables. It sounds like a suitable place for a dying gambler to spend his remaining time. Will I see you again? Doc smiled. Probably not. Our paths are unlikely to cross twice. But I will remember you and your people. I will remember what I learned here. And if the stories of Doc Holliday ever reach your ears in the years to come, you will know that part of what made him what he is came from a month spent among the Cheyenne, learning what courage truly means. He rode out of the valley without looking back, heading toward the distant line of the horizon and whatever waited beyond it. Behind him, Running Wolf watched until the pale figure on horseback disappeared into the vastness of the prairie. The Cheyenne would continue their fight for another decade, struggling against an enemy that had overwhelming numbers, superior technology, and the relentless momentum of a civilization determined to claim everything in its path. They would lose, as they had always known they would lose, but they would lose with their dignity intact, their courage unbroken, their story carved into the history of a land that had been theirs since time beyond memory. Doc Holliday would go on to become exactly the legend that later generations would remember. Tombstone, the OK Corral, the friendship with Wyatt Earp that would define his final years, the endless gambling, the violent confrontations, the coughing fits that grew worse until they finally claimed him in a Colorado sanatorium in 1887. But those who knew him best, those who saw past the mythology to the man beneath, sometimes noticed something that did not fit the image. A respect for indigenous peoples that was unusual for his time. A willingness to question the assumptions of white superiority that most frontiersmen took for granted. A certain quality in his courage that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere recklessness or indifference to death. The stories never mentioned his time among the Cheyenne. There were no records, no documentation, no witnesses who survived to tell the tale. It became one of those episodes that history almost erased, buried under the weight of more dramatic narratives and more convenient mythologies. Almost. Chapter 6. The Legacy That Endures. There are stories that history remembers and stories that history forgets. The difference between them is often nothing more than chance, the random survival of a letter or a diary, the accident of a witness who happened to write things down. The encounter between Doc Holliday and the Cheyenne warriors fell into the category of forgotten stories, lost to the vast silence that swallowed so much of what actually happened on the frontier. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because a story was never recorded does not mean it did not occur. The Old West was full of moments that shaped the people involved and then vanished without a trace, known only to those who experienced them and dying when those witnesses died. What we know for certain is this. Doc Holliday emerged from the summer of 1876 a different man than he had been before. Something had changed in him during those months between leaving Texas and arriving in the Colorado mining towns. The transformation was subtle, visible only to those who looked closely, but it was real. He became less reckless in his violence, more selective in his confrontations. He showed unexpected compassion for people on the margins of society, the outcasts and the dispossessed, who reminded him perhaps of other marginalized peoples he had encountered. He spoke occasionally of the Cheyenne with a respect that surprised those who expected the casual racism of the time. These changes do not prove that the story told here is true. They merely suggest that something happened, something that left its mark on a man who was already dying and knew it, something that gave him a perspective on life and death that he had not possessed before. The Cheyenne themselves preserved their own version of events through oral tradition, passed from generation to generation in the way that their people had always preserved knowledge. They spoke of a pale stranger who came among them, a man who carried sickness in his chest but courage in his heart, who fought beside them against their enemies, and then vanished back into the world from which he had come. The details varied depending on who told the story and when. Some versions made Doc a larger-than-life hero, others a minor figure who happened to be in the right place at the right time, but all versions agreed on the essential truth, that for a brief period, two worlds had intersected in ways that changed everyone involved. Perhaps that is the real lesson of this story. Not the violence or the confrontation, but the connection. Two people from utterly different backgrounds, with every reason to see each other as enemies, found instead a basis for mutual respect. They recognized in each other the qualities that transcend cultural boundaries: courage, honesty, the willingness to face death without flinching. In a time when their peoples were locked in a conflict that could only end one way, They discovered that individual human beings are not reducible to the categories that history assigns them. Doc Holliday was not simply a representative of white civilization. Running Wolf was not simply a representative of indigenous resistance. They were men, complex and contradictory, capable of seeing past the surface to the humanity beneath. That capacity for recognition, for connection across seemingly unbridgeable divides, is perhaps the most important legacy of their encounter. It suggests that even in the darkest chapters of history, even when entire peoples are being displaced and destroyed, the possibility of genuine human understanding persists. It is a hopeful message from an unhopeful time, and it is worth remembering. Doc Holliday died on November 8, 1887, in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. His last words, according to those present, were, "This is funny." He had always expected to die in a gunfight, to go out in a blaze of violence. Instead, he went quietly, the consumption that had stalked him for years finally claiming its inevitable victory. He was 36 years old. He had packed more life into those years than most people manage in twice that span. And somewhere in the story of his life, in the chapters that history almost erased, there was a summer when he rode with Cheyenne warriors and learned what it truly meant to face the end with dignity. Running Wolf's fate is less certain. The Cheyenne were eventually confined to reservations, their lands taken, their way of life systematically dismantled. Some adapted to the new reality, others resisted until resistance was no longer possible. Whether Running Wolf survived to see the final defeat of his people, whether he lived long enough to tell his grandchildren about the strange pale stranger who had once fought beside him, we cannot know. But his message endures. The wisdom that he shared with Doc Holliday, the lesson about facing the end of one's world with courage and grace, that wisdom has been passed down through generations of indigenous peoples who have survived everything that history has thrown at them. They are still here. Their culture persists. Their stories continue to be told. And somewhere in those stories, preserved in ways that outsiders may never fully understand, the encounter between a Cheyenne warrior and a dying gunfighter lives on. That is the power of stories. They outlast the people who tell them. They carry truths across time, from generation to generation, until those truths become part of the fabric of human understanding. The duel that history almost erased refuses to be completely forgotten because the truth it contains is too important to lose. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to act despite fear. It is the decision to face death, whether your own death or the death of your world, without surrendering your dignity or your values. Doc Holliday understood this. Running Wolf understood this. And now, perhaps, you understand it too. If you watched this far, it is because something in this story spoke to you. Something in the encounter between these two men, across all the barriers of culture and history, resonated with truths you already knew but might not have had words for. I want to get to know you, the people who make it to the end, who invest their time in stories that matter. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far so I can see who you are," and thank you personally for being part of this community. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about courage and connection in ways you had not before, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These are the stories that history tried to bury, and they deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another chapter of the past that shaped our present. Together we will continue to unearth the hidden stories, the forgotten encounters, the moments when ordinary people did extraordinary things. Because every story matters. Every life contains lessons. And sometimes, the most important truths are the ones that history almost erased. Thank you for watching. Until next time.